Hi class, so this week we're covering part 3, Citizenship and Immigration, Constructing Nationality, Borders, and Belonging. So most people acquire citizenship by birth rather than through naturalization. However, things were different in the case of Dred Scott. He was enslaved and tried to use the federal court to sue for his freedom. However, access to the courts was predicated on citizenship, and his claim was dismissed by the U.S. Supreme Court, stating that all blacks, free and enslaved, were not and could never be citizens because they were subordinate and inferior class of beings.
My great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation in Southampton, Virginia. He was born to the Blow family. They eventually moved to St. Louis. At this point, they had debts, and they had to sell something to cure those debts. My great-great-grandfather was purchased by an army surgeon.
The slave is taken into the Wisconsin Territory in what is now Minnesota.
And he met and married a young lady. Slaves were prohibited actually to marry. So it's pretty special that they actually had a wedding. Brought back to St. Louis with his family. At that point, he had something unique. Missouri had a law that said once free, always free.
And Wisconsin Territory is free soil, no slavery.
If a slaveholder were to take a slave and live in the North, then that slave would be liberated.
They were no longer a slave.
But their owner refuses to free them. And in 1846, the slaves enter this courtroom to seek their freedom.
At first it was just about their family, but ultimately it was about a nation. And my ancestor was Dred Scott.
A jury of 12 white men set Dred and Harriet Scott free.
It was a wonderful day, but it was short-lived.
Scott's owner appeals the verdict.
And then the Supreme Court of Missouri changed the precedent of Missouri to say, it didn't free him, and that's when he brought his federal action.
Dred Scott's case lands in the U.S. Supreme Court. The court was stacked against Scott. Of the 9 justices, 5 were from slave states, and a 6th from Pennsylvania also favored slavery. The justices voted 7-2 against Scott, and they did something the framers never imagined. They invented a constitutional right to own slaves.
Some of the worst jurisprudence by our United States.
That was the classic example of the Supreme Court taking upon itself to do what it thought was right and not adhere to the text of the Constitution as it was written.
In his decision, Chief Justice Taney writes,
Negroes have been regarded as beings of inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. And the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
What Dred Scott did was to say, yes, they said all men are created equal, but they didn't mean it.
In terms of how it feels now as I'm saying this to you, it angers me. How can one man tell another man that he's benefiting me by enslaving me?
I can't imagine that anything could be worse.
And that blacks could never be citizens for as long as they lived in America.
Because you cannot possibly be, under any circumstances, a citizen of the United States if you're black and you're descendant from slaves.
Taney thought he was going to resolve the slavery controversy forever by basically saying, stop arguing about this question, it's settled. But he was wrong. You don't settle a controversy like that simply by saying, I'm right, you're wrong.
Within 3 months of the Dred Scott decision, they did get their freedom. And they did not get it through the courts, but they got it from the hand of the children of their original owners. Dred and Harriet were simple people. The fact that they were born in slavery did not deny them their humanity, nor any human desires as anyone else would have. Their greatest desire was freedom.
The laws still weren't living up to that ideal. In fact, the Dred Scott case was a big step backwards.
Most northern states were content to let the southern states be the southern states. And they weren't prepared to do anything about slavery in the South.
Until the Dred Scott decision.
And that led to a grave perception of a threat. The North finally cared about slavery in a way they hadn't before. And then we know what happened after that.
Between December 1860 and the following June, 11 states secede from the Union and ignite the worst constitutional crisis in American history.
So Dred Scott was invalidated after the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared that all persons born in the U.S. and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are declared to be citizens of the U.S. and of the state wherein they reside. So after the Dred Scott decision came the 14th Amendment, and despite the broad language, some racial minorities still remain outside the bounds of that amendment. In particular, questions persisted about citizenship status of children who were born in the U.S. to non-citizen parents and about Native Americans. So in the U.S. versus Wong Kim arc, the Supreme Court ruled that native-born children of non-citizens, even those permanently barred by race from acquiring citizenship, were birthright citizens of the U.S. And then in the Elk versus Wilkins, they ruled that Native Americans owed allegiance to their tribe and so did not acquire citizenship upon birth. So it wasn't until about 1924 when Congress passed an act conferring citizens on all Native Americans in the U.S. So naturalization is the other form in which you can become citizens. So at first, naturalization was limited to any non-citizen being free white persons who have resided within the limits and under jurisdiction of the U.S. for 2 years. So in order to become naturalized, you had to be a free white person and you had to live or reside within the jurisdiction of the U.S. for at least 2 years. Those laws were abolished in 1952, where they allowed both whites and blacks. So both whites and blacks were eligible for citizenship, but not others, particularly those from Asia. And then in 1940, Congress opened naturalizations to descendants of races indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. Then in 1942, the Chinese. And then in 1946, the Philippines and India. So by now you guys have heard my accent, and some of you probably wondered where I'm from. Some of you probably already asked. However, yes, I am a U.S. citizen. I earned my citizenship by naturalization. I was born and raised in Belize, Central America. I moved to the U.S. when I was 19 as a permanent resident. And after living here for about, I want to say 4 or 5 years, I filed for my citizenship, and that's when I was naturalized. So for those of you who are not familiar with naturalization, I'm just going to give you a little bit of my experience. So I'm pretty sure everybody probably have a different experience, but just from my experience alone, as far as I know, that if you are a permanent resident, so that's when you come into the U.S. legally, and basically you come in with what's called a green card, so you have, I guess, permission to live in the U.S. and work in the U.S. However, it's for a limited time. I think generally it's for 10 years. Mine was for 10 years when I first came, but it can be limited as well, because I've known people who may have only had it for 1 year and then they had to renew it every year. When I came, mine was good for 10 years, and you can file for citizenship living in the U.S. for 5 years, I want to say. However, if you got married to an American citizen, then I think it's reduced to like 2 or 3 years. I can't remember exactly. So basically, from what I remember, it's been a while, but from what I remember, you file the paperwork for citizenship once you reach the time that, you're eligible. You file the paperwork, you pay your fee. The fee definitely changes over the course of the years. way back when it was maybe less than $100. By the time I did mine, it was like $400. I'm not sure what it is now, but I'm pretty sure it's way higher because I've had mine for, I want to say, at least 5 or 10 years. So I'm pretty sure it's definitely way more than that now. But so you pay your fee, and then you get an appointment to do like your test. You have to come in, and then they ask you all these questions, I guess, about U.S. history. You have to pass the test. Once you pass the test, then you're called in for, I guess, the naturalization ceremony. So you come in, and it's like a bunch of other people there as well, and you get what we call sworn in. So you raise the right hand, and I guess you get sworn in and stuff. That was my experience. Like I said, it can be different for other people. There's so many different reasons as to how many people come to the US or why they're here, or whether they came in on a visa, whether they came in as a permanent resident. So there's so many different ways that you can come into the US, and that will determine like whether you are eligible for citizenship or not. Another way you're eligible, if your parent is a citizen. So let's say you have a parent who's a citizen and you come into the US as a child, so under the age of 21, then you're automatically a citizen. So you can just file the paperwork and you're basically a citizen. So for a nation made up mostly of immigrants, the US has always had a problem with immigration. Long before President Trump, generations of Americans have advocated limiting immigration to this country. So we're going to discuss several different eras. The first one is First Era. This was considered the free white persons and Asian coolies. So basically, poor and unskilled immigrants from Northern Europe and Asia came into the US in the mid 1800s, and most of the European immigrants were German and Irish, and under the law, they were considered free white persons able to achieve citizenship. Now, citizenship wasn't an option for the growing numbers of Chinese and Asian immigrants who were settling on the West Coast. A cheap source of labor for mines, farms, and railways, the Chinese were called coolies, the word which originally meant unskilled laborer but became a slur at workers who labored for low wages or came to the US as indentured laborers. So during the First Era, there was about 3 major immigration laws that were passed during that time. The first one was the Naturalization Act, which allowed African Americans and those of African descent to become US citizens. Other non-whites remained unable to obtain citizenship. There was the Asian Exclusion Act, which established federal regulation of immigration and prohibited bringing Asians into the US without their consent and supplying Asians for labor. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited immigration based on a specific ethnicity. It prohibited skilled and unskilled laborers and Chinese employed in mining from coming to the US for about 10 years. During the Second Era, also considered as Southern Europeans not welcome, during the next wave of immigration, which was about the 1800s to the 1920s, immigration laws continued to target Asians, but also tried to discourage immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So during this time, there were about 7 major immigration laws that were passed. The immigration law, which allowed deportation of immigrants in the country illegally or excluded by previous laws. The Gary Act, which extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years. The Asian Barred Zone Act, which required a literacy test for all immigrants over 16 in an effort to stop unskilled immigration and prohibited Asians, except for Filipinos and Japanese, from immigrating to the US. We had the Emergency Quota Act, which created the first numerical quotas for immigration based on nationality. We also had an act that established the Border Patrol, as well as an act that established quota system based on country of origin. And then we have the current era, which secure the border, and build a wall. So during this era, we had 10 major immigration laws and executive actions, including the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is DACA. This is an executive action, not a law, that shielded more than 700,000 young adults from deportation. They were also granted 2-year work permits. So for people who were between the ages of 15 and 30 who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children, they were granted 2-year work permits. And the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans in Lawful Permanent Residence, which is the DAPA. This was also an executive action, so not a law, that sought to remove the threat of deportation for more than 4 million immigrant parents of children who are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. Then looking at immigration under Trump, there were several executive orders in 2017. So on January 25th, Trump ordered an overhaul of immigration law enforcement, stripping away most restrictions on who should be deported, which about 8 million in the country illegally could be targeted for deportation. On January 27th, Trump signed an executive order banning travelers from 7 predominantly Muslim countries for 90 days and then stopping Syrian refugees indefinitely. However, federal courts put the order on hold. And then on March 6th, Trump administration revised the ban, limiting to 6 countries. And federal judges in Hawaii and Maryland still stopped it from taking effect. But on June 26th, the Supreme Court allowed much of Trump's revised travel ban to take effect, with some exceptions for those who had bona fide relationships with Americans or U.S. entities, including spouses or other close family members, employers, and universities. And on August 2nd, Trump endorsed a bill that would create an immigration system based on merit and skills instead of family connections. So these are just some of the different immigration laws and executive actions that were passed in the different eras of immigration in the U.S. So how did immigration become illegal? The country of immigrants narrative is very much a narrative of race. Immigrants were conceived as white Europeans, so the only people allowed to naturalize. And their presence and comfort depended on labor of people who were legally excluded. Throughout the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, Mexicans, like African Americans prior to 1868, were accepted as necessary evil for their labor and considered unthreatening to the white nature of the country that viewed them as exploitable workers rather than as potential citizens. So the U.S. has benefited greatly from cheap immigrant workers and by investing in export-oriented economies in Latin America. The U.S. creates an enormous demand for low-wage, informal, and seasonal labor. This exploitation is accomplished through international institutions, military interventions, trade agreements, and corporate privilege. Also, employers often knowingly hire these workers who are undocumented. And then when workers try to improve working conditions, these employers use the law to fire them or intimidate them. So the new generation of undocumented youth is using their voice, art, and social media to challenge the way society views and discusses immigrants and immigrations. They are challenging terms such as illegal and alien when referring to a person. So, especially in social work, these terms are not appropriate, right? So we don't call someone illegal. So in calling these terms dehumanizing and bringing attention to the harm that these labels can cause, the undocumented population is taking control of the narrative. When the undocumented population tell their stories and call out the language that can be problematic, they are challenging anti-immigrant culture and raising awareness about immigration policy. So these are just some ways that the undocumented population is challenging the discrimination that they're facing. As social workers, we can join in and we can also make sure that we are challenging this language and that we as social workers, we are not using this type of language and educate people when we hear them. So since the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the uncertain distinction that Arabs and Muslims hold is that They are the first new communities of suspicion after the civil rights era to face the question of whether American society will treat them as equals. So there are two different cases that the book discusses. So in 1842, in the Hassan's case, the court decided that Arabs were not white persons, and on that basis, they denied naturalization. Less than a year and a half later, in 1944, in the other case, the court changed its mind, citing that it was the vital interest of the US as a world power to have friendlier relationships with other countries in treating all men as created equal. And this was an important goal for them to accomplish.
I think the Latino identity is pretty confusing to me because oftentimes I find it in a little checkbox on a form and I'm confused on whether I should put Latino or Hispanic, but I'm Mexican.
As Latin Americans, as Hispanics in the U.S., there's a community that gets built regardless of which specific country you're coming from.
And our history is a history of African people, indigenous people, Europeans, conquistadores, all these different people colliding, many times not with their consent. So that informs all these loaded issues people have.
It's like navigating three identities. If you're from the States, you're American, you're Black, and you're Latina. Furthermore, wherever country that you identify in coming from. And that's a lot to navigate.
But at this point in my life, I actually don't identify as Guatemalan, and it's something that I guess a lot of like young immigrants sort of feel, where there's this saying like, ni de aquí, ni de allá, not from there, not from here.
In trying to blend in with the culture in America, I gave up a lot of what I grew up with. Maybe I saw it as something that was kind of shameful or in the way. I wanted to dress like my friends in America. I wanted to talk like them. I wanted to be like them, listen to the same music. I started listening to country music.
I got all these crazy questions like, did you come here in a canoe? And do you know what snow is? And do you live in a hut in Puerto Rico?
I thought my name was Spick until I was about 13. And that was my first awareness that race was an issue.
People say, oh, you look like a white dude. In some context, not in all contexts, depends where I am, depends who I'm with, depends whole lot of things. Depends what language I'm speaking, but however I look, when I leave my name, I can't get a phone call back about an apartment in New York City. And this isn't like 10 places I call, this is like 30.
And I remember telling a kid one time, I was like, let me tell you, the Ku Klux Klan comes here, and they see your last name, you're going too, bro. You know, and the kids are like, what are you talking about? And it was like a big thing.
People generally, you know, unless I speak Spanish, you know, people assume right away, I mean, that I'm African American, that I'm Black. You know, I mean, it's, you know, just one of those things. It may be the deep voice, it may be the color of my skin.
Because I talk white, I'm not Dominican, or I'm not Black, or I'm not Afro-Latina, or whoever people perceive me as of being. And that hurt, and that still hurts.
Because one of my daughters is lighter than the other, they had Blackness issues. And I remember my oldest daughter telling my youngest daughter that she was Black and that her hair, she said something, and I remember crying like immediately, like, oh my God. No. And I had to sit them down and talk to them about our roots and that everything that they learned from the family was wrong.
I feel like I wanted more of my culture. You know, I grew up, there was a point I stopped speaking Spanish to her, and I still don't speak to her in Spanish. So I feel like something was lost, and I don't know if it was just because she was busy raising 5 kids and didn't really think about culture in that way and how I would come to identify myself.
Growing up, you know, like this, as as a young teenager, I told people I was Puerto Rican, which is completely, which is right. But at a particular point when I became a little more politicized, I was definitely more of a black nationalist than I was a Puerto Rican nationalist. Maybe because the concept of black nationalism and the black liberation movement is so much more accessible. There isn't a language issue. So yeah, I totally was reading Malcolm and Marcus and James Baldwin and Huey Newton before I read any of the Puerto Rican nationalists.
Either you're black or you're white, and if you're like kind of in the middle, you kind of like don't want to be in the middle. You want to, a lot of us want to be white, but we're still brown. We're still color. We still have color. We're still, according to what the institution is telling us, what race is based on your skin color. So you're like, I'm brown. So that's kind of like where it came. Like I'm not black. And I'm not white, and I don't want to be white, so I'm kind of brown, and this is kind of like a thing that's there.
If you are closer to being white, you are supreme. If you are not, you are less than. And to me, that's how I've understood it, and that's why I think it's very important that Latinos who look like me say, you identify as Latino, cool, Colombiano, cool, whatever else, but you benefit from light skin privilege. The fact that you have ojos claros, people want to fetishize that, understand what that means. However much I might want to say, oh my gosh, I'm so special because I have green eyes, you're perpetuating white supremacy by running with that.
I'll talk to a young girl, a young teenager, and she'll say, I'm not white enough to fit into mainstream society. I'm not Black American enough to fit in that, in that faction of society. And I'm like, but you know what? You're the best person to be kind of like a connector between both, because in you is everything. And being Latino in an American kind of New World way is basically being a physical embodiment of how America began as we know it. So you're every woman. So for me, being Latino is being phenomenal.
So that was an interesting conversation with some Latinos on race. And like one of the guys said on the video, I've had that experience as well. Sometimes when people look at me, they just assume I'm African American until I open my mouth. So once that accent comes out, then they're like, wait, she's not African American. So every decade, the Census Bureau spends billions of dollars and deploys hundreds of thousands of workers to get an accurate picture of the American population. Among the questions on the census is one about race. And there are like 15 choices, including some other race. Well, more than about 18 million Latinos checked the other box in 2010 when the census was done then. And this was an increase from about 14.9 million in 2000. It'll be interesting to see what that number is now. I know the census was done again this year, so it'll be interesting to compare those numbers as to whether that number is going up or whether it went back down. So this was an indication of the sharp disconnect between how Latinos view themselves and how the government wants to count them. So many Latinos argue that the race categories that the government uses, which is their very conception of identity, does not fit them. To be honest, when I first moved to the US was the first time that I can remember having to check a box. I mean, growing up in Belize, I don't know if it's because I was younger. Like I said, I moved here when I was 19, so maybe I didn't have much experience with filling out paperwork and things like that. But I never remember having to worry about what race I was or what box I needed to check. When I moved to the US and everything you fill out, you basically have to check a box as to what your race is, your ethnicity, or whatever. And so my first experience with that, I would just check Black or African American because most of the time they were combined. It says Black or African American. And looking at the choices, I just assumed, okay, I feel like I've never had experience with this, but if you're trying to put me into a category, I guess this is the category that would best fit me. And so I would check that. And I was in my master's program taking a diversity class, and that was the first time that I really understood ethnicity, and I really understood things like, wait, you're Latino, you're, people from Central America, they're considered Hispanic Latinos. Again, like I said, I never really had to think about that until moving to the US. So the census categorizes people by race, which typically refers to a common set of physical traits. But Latinos identify themselves more by their culture, by their language, by customs and things like that, rather than physical traits. So that's why we're running into the issue on the census where they just don't know what to pick because they don't feel like the categories that are given fits them. So when they encounter the census, they see one question that may ask them whether they identify themselves as having Hispanic ethnic origins, and many answer it as their main identifier. But then there's another question asking them about their race because, as the census guide notes, people of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origins may be of any race. And so more than about 1/3 Latinos check other as their race. So like I mentioned before, I was always just checking Black or African American until I took that diversity class in the master's program. And then I was made aware that, hey, you're Hispanic, Latino, you need to be checking that box as well. So now I check both. I do check Black and I do check Hispanic, Latino as my ethnicity. The culture is different. I'm Black, but I'm not African American. And so my experience is completely different from someone who's an African American, someone who's Black, was born in this country. And a lot of times we're just thrown into one category, and it shouldn't be because, like I said, our culture is different, our experiences are different. So the census data on race serves many different purposes, including determining the makeup of voting districts and monitoring discriminatory practices in hiring and racial disparities in education and health. So race matters, and how Latinos identify themselves and how the census count them affects the political influence of Latinos and any other minority groups. For example, some studies have found that African Latinos tend to be significantly more supportive of government-sponsored healthcare and much less supportive of the death penalty than Latinos who identify as white. So a majority of Latinos identify themselves as white, and some drop the Latino label to call themselves simply white. So about a quarter of third-generation children who have Mexican ancestry do not identify their children as Latino on census forms. So most of this ethnic attrition occurs among the offspring of parents or grandparents who are married to non-Mexicans who are usually non-Hispanic whites. These Latinos tend to have high education, high earnings, and high levels of English fluency. This means that many successful Latinos are no longer present in statistics tracking Latino economic and social progress across generations. So on the other side, you have Black Latinos who say that they feel the sting of racism much the same as other Blacks. So foreign-born Blacks are both affected by the historical racism and oppression that Black Americans face, for example, residential segregation, and they're also treated as different, better, hardworking, smarter, that is, as the good Blacks. So foreign-born Blacks, that would be me. Interesting that I do have an example of that. I had a friend who, she's also a Latina. She's from Guatemala, so on the border of Belize, so we're next door neighbors, right? But she's from Guatemala. She does live here in the US as well. And so we were having a conversation one day about, I can't remember what was going on at the time, but we were having a conversation about, it had something to do with Black people or African Americans. And I really hate that I can't remember what it was about. But anyways, we were having the conversation and I just brought up the fact that, yeah, I can't really, I know I'm Black, but I really can't say that I understand, or I can't really say that I relate to African Americans in a lot of things just because our culture is so different. And she's like, oh no, no, you're not Black. Oh no, you're not like them. And I was like in shock. As a Black person, as a foreign-born Black person, you do get both. You do get that racism and oppression that Black Americans face. You do experience some of that as well. And then on the other hand, sometimes you may get treated different as better or hardworking or smarter, or what they're considered here as the good Blacks. And so you may get both of those experiences. And I have to say, I feel like I've experienced both of those experiences. However, I was just shocked that, people think that way. So forced integration of native-born and foreign-born blacks can also produce tension or mistrust and competition about black groups. Like in the first statement where, if they're getting treated differently or as better or more hardworking and things like that, this can lead to tension or mistrust or even competition. So black immigrants are sometimes described as invisible immigrants because they're often folded in with the black Americans as part of one racial group. And many times they're not really compared to any other immigrant groups. So a lot of times when we think about immigrants, we really don't think about black people, right? That's because they're just grouped in with black Americans. And so we kind of forget about them. We forget that we have black immigrants. There are some challenges to black racial alliances across African American and immigrant groups. And these include interracial tensions, in-group superiorities, ethnocentrism, and overall group tensions that are due to limited access to the larger political and economic goals. So on the other hand, black racial alliance is enabled by these structures of competition and striving to avoid anything but last place in the social order because they create a bond based on an understanding of the meaning of blackness and the occurrence of structural racism. Here's a video from the author herself, Dr. Christina Greer, who wrote this section of the book. So let's hear from the author herself.
There she is, back by popular demand, Dr. Christina Greer, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. Good to see you.
Great to see you.
You have a book coming out. The book is called Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream.
Yes.
Now, wait a minute. I'm sitting there going, Christina is writing a book that's somewhat based on lots of experiences you've had, but going back to your Tufts experience. Tufts was, it's outside of Boston, right?
In Medford, Massachusetts.
Now, you were there when?
In the late 90s.
As a...
As an undergraduate student, yeah.
You became fascinated by the idea that there are, quote, black subgroups. Break it down.
Okay.
That's the premise of the book.
Right,
no?
yes. That's the premise.
Is that a good setup?
And thinking about how these different subgroups can actually have substantive coalition building, right? With the diversity within this larger African American group.
Right.
So the way I label these groups, just to make sure there's very little confusion, is that I label them as Black Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and African Americans. So Black Americans are people whose descendants are sort of from U.S. slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, and ninth generation Americans, essentially. Afro-Caribbeans are people whose relatives are from the Caribbean, and African Americans I actually classify as individuals who are from the continent of Africa.
So what happened at Tufts that made it clear that you weren't all...
Well, so we were all, there are sort of two things. One was we all went to the Cape sort of before school started, and there's an activity where it stuck in my head for many, many years, and when I got to grad school, it sort of came up again because you see diversity at Columbia University, taught and attended several universities. So one of the activities was to close your eyes and to raise your hands if your parents told you, when you go to Tufts in Massachusetts, don't get wrapped up and, be careful when you hang out with the black kids, which I thought was a very odd question because this is a group of just black people in a room. And so, of course, I opened up my eyes. I was never good at, 7-Up or any of those games. And almost everyone had their hands raised, which was a little odd to me because this was the first time that I was ever at an institution with a critical mass of African Americans. So that was the first activity, and we sort of talked about that and fleshed that out, which we'll get to in a second. And then the second activity was I was very involved with the Pan-African Alliance, which in many colleges and universities, especially predominantly white colleges and universities, it's called like the Black Student Union, or the Black Student Association. And so that was a very active and vibrant group, sort of charity trips and working with the Tufts Senate and, trying to really have substantive conversations about diversity on the campus, not just race, but also class. But while I was there, two subgroups broke off, and so the Caribbean Club was formed and the African Student Association was formed. But those students also kept allegiance to the Pan-African Alliance.
So you have this in your head, you have it in your heart, you're thinking about it.
Yes.
And you go and you say, I'm going to write a book about what? The subgroups and whether you're really all black?
Right. No, whether or not we can pinpoint what policy issues actually help foster substantive coalition building. And so I came to this conclusion because there's a great book by Marty Gillens, who's a professor at Princeton, called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And it's a book that only looks at white attitudes toward welfare. So in graduate school, you know, I was taking a quantitative methods course, and I replicated his data. That's
The one I took twice at Rutgers? But I'm sorry, go ahead.
I now teach quantitative methods, and I try and make it as interesting as possible. So I wanted to replicate his data, but I was very curious as to why he didn't ask any African Americans in the survey, just because welfare disproportionately affects African Americans. So I replicated his data about whites, but I also added in blacks. But when you're a graduate student and you're playing around with data, the whole point is to add in new variables to see, you know, gun control issues and all these other things. So I added in a parent nativity variable.
Where they came from.
Right, where your parents came from.
That's right.
So what I found was whites whose parents were not born in the United States were more likely to support welfare, and whites whose parents were born in the United States were less likely to support welfare. So basically, immigrant whites supported it, native-born whites didn't. And so when I ran the data for blacks, it was immigrant blacks did not support it, native-born blacks supported it.
But the bigger picture differences that you found are?
Well, on government spending issues. So I basically broke down government spending issues on sort of general issues and racialized issues. And what I found was when there were specific government spending issues on immigration specifically, or issues that dealt specifically with ethnicity, we saw some differences. But for the vast majority of the issues, we saw them break down in sort of blacks versus whites. Statistics work when you actually have interviews that can back up what you found with your numbers, right? So I can say 50% of the people in this interview are women. Well, that's one out of two. So you need some more substance behind these numbers. So when I looked at the numbers, I would then, when interviewed specific members of Local 371, which is a social services employees union in New York City, because I wanted controls for class. I didn't want doctors and nannies and cab drivers and teachers. I found that the controls for class are great, right, and education, but there is a duality that exists for black ethnic groups in the United States in the sense that they definitely believe that there is a shared racial identity because there are many things that happen to black people who are phenotypically black once they're in the United States, right? So keep in mind, black immigrants are coming from black countries, largely with black leadership. So the way they conceptualize race, I mean, there's not to say that there isn't colorism and there are ethnic groups and subgroups and religious groups, but the way the black-white divide, the sort of historical black-white divide that's in America, plays out very differently here.
Book's out?
The book should be out sometime next fall.
Terrific. We're talking about 2013, fall 2013. Also, we'll talk about what happened in the 2012 election. We'll try to make sense of that. Dr. Christina Greer, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Fordham University. The book is called Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. We'll also talk more about how that view of the American dream is evolving. Christina, always a pleasure when we have you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good stuff.
Great.
This is One-on-One. I'm Steve Adubato. We'll be right back right after this.
So black immigrants as well as black Americans do share some of the same experiences when it comes to racism and oppression. They are sometimes categorized as the same group. However, they do have some differences in culture and their beliefs and things like that. Like in the video we saw where black immigrants did not support welfare and black Americans did. We see that both groups may have some similarities in terms of some of their experiences. However, they are different groups and they do have different beliefs and different values and things like that. So again, we have to see them as two different groups. So despite the challenges various populations from Asian countries face in immigrating to the US, there's a persistent myth that they will do well because they have strong family values and because of their work ethic. But then this notion becomes a measure for what all minorities need in order to get ahead. The negative impact the myth of model minority has had on Latino and African Americans in the US has been through a conservative perception that distorts the values of these communities. Conservatives have exploited this racial stereotype, arguing that Asians fare well in the US because of their strong family values and their work ethic. They say that these values and not government assistance are what all minorities need in order to get ahead. Because Asian American success stems from their strong families and their dedication to education and hard work, conservatives say that then the poverty of Latinos and African Americans must be explained by their own values. So they are saying that they are poor because of their non-marrying, school skipping, and generally lazy and irresponsible behavior, which government handouts only encourage. A closer look at the data paints a different picture, however. If Asian American households earn more than whites, statistics suggest it's not because their individual earnings are higher, but because Asian Americans live in larger households with more working adults. In addition, Southeast Asia does not have a lot of the advantages of other Asian communities. They lack both financial resources and formal schooling. Refugees found themselves trapped in poverty, providing low-cost labor and receiving no health or other benefits, while their lack of schooling also made decent jobs hard to come by. There is a high number of dropout rates, and if they do graduate, there's a low number going on to higher education. So for the sake of preserving the model minority, Southeast Asians have been overlooked.
First of all, as the name describes, it is not something that is actually real, despite what people want to believe about the supposed success of Asian Americans as a racial group. It's also a term that was coined in the 1960s by a white journalist. So it's also not something that's coming from within the community, unlike the phrase Asian American, which actually was a label that was created by Asian American activists and organizers in the late 60s and early 70s as a way to get away from the term Oriental. And if there's anyone out there who's still using the term Oriental to refer to people of Asian descent, please stop. So the first thing is that this isn't true, right? Asian Americans are not succeeding because there is something inherent to us or our culture, despite what people like Amy Chua might think. The second thing is it's not true that Asian Americans are this, undisputed success story. So when you start to drill down into Asian ethnic groups and you look at the rates of Southeast Asian communities, like specifically Hmong and Laotian and Burmese, they have among the lowest graduation rates from high school, among the lowest socioeconomic status, among the lowest college attendance.
The model minority myth is hard to explain. It's the idea that Asian immigrants and their American-born children are smart, talented, hardworking, good at math and science. When you complain, people want to say, how thin-skinned could you be? Why are you politically correct? They're trying to pay you a compliment. Yet it's false flattery. It allows the whitewashing of the very real problems. It allows people to say, what are you complaining about? You're doing better here than you would in your homeland. Of course, not realizing that America is our homeland. It's a way to say that Asian Americans don't need any help and shouldn't be shown any solicitude. It also ratchets up racial resentment. The idea that you're hardworking and an overachiever suggests maybe a little too hardworking. You're an overachiever. You're getting more than your fair share. Why are the Asians taking over? They have all the seats at the prestigious institution, all the scholarships. They win every spelling bee and science fair and math competition. It's all these people named Kim and Yuen and Patel. Where are the real Americans?
What the model minority myth does, what the journalist, when he first used it, meant to do was praise Japanese Americans in the 1960s and to say, look at these good, hardworking, quiet, passive people who come to the United States and they don't cause any trouble. And the subtext of that was, unlike the way that Black Americans are currently causing trouble for the United States.
It's another way, not even very subtle, of saying to African Americans and other people of color, the Asians, they made it. Why can't you?
Okay, so clearly we can see it's damaging because it is somehow creating a binary between Asians as a good minority who are able to succeed and then every other racial minority group, Latinx people, indigenous people, and of course, Black Americans. And I certainly think there are people, not just white Americans, but we can look at Candace Owens, for example, who is using this model minority rhetoric to somehow create divisions between Asian Americans and Black Americans or other racial minorities. Now, there are plenty of Asian Americans who don't believe this and have never bought into this. There have always been individual Asian Americans who have worked in solidarity for social justice. The poster behind me is of Grace Lee Boggs, who was a notable Detroit activist who spent her lifetime really advocating for the rights of poor people everywhere, as well as disenfranchised people everywhere, but especially in her local community of Detroit. And then the other thing is that there have always been Asian Americans who are actively trying to resist this stereotype, who resisted the stereotype before the stereotype even existed. People like Yuri Kochiyama, Japanese American activist. Very famously, there's a photo of her cradling the head of Malcolm X when he was assassinated in New York City. And then, you know, in our present day, there are so many Asian American leaders who are fighting on behalf of social justice and especially against anti-Black racism. So I think we need to say this, not to discount the racism that exists in Asian American communities, because there is anti-Black racism that exists within Asian American communities, but we need to say this to show that the narrative is always much more complicated than people want to believe.
For Asian Americans, there's been the perennial bewilderment in black-white tensions. With this color line, we're neither black nor white. Where do we fit in? How can we help? How have we expressed prejudice or enjoyed privilege? How is it possible to be an ally and yet acknowledge that Asian Americans have had their own set of unique challenges? There is no right answer, but it's so important to ask these questions.
I guess what I would say is that I hope, first of all, that if there's anyone out there who is Asian American identified, who somehow thinks that this is a compliment, please be aware that it's not a compliment. People saying that you are a model minority is actually inaccurate. It's very damaging, and it's definitely divisive.
I'm always encouraging Asian Americans to stand up and speak out by bridge building in coalition with others who share their ideals. You know, many East Asian cultures have an attitude. The best known version is the Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up is pounded down, right? 不要找麻烦, right? It's the idea, don't go looking for trouble. Compare that to the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So for many who have come from backgrounds where there wasn't civil society, there hasn't been civic engagement, they don't have that tradition. But here in America, it's necessary. We have to come together. And to say we're American is to signal that, not just to others, but to ourselves, to say this now is our home.
So as we can see with the myth of the model minority, it is definitely damaging and it is affecting other minority groups. All right, so this brings us to the end of part 3. Hopefully this made us more aware of immigration and some of the experiences of different groups, especially minority groups, dealing with immigration and their experiences in the US.